They don't think the soil's very good, but with the manioc and rice as their basic diet, they can meet their everyday needs. A few years ago, their children's family joined them and built a house a short distance down the road. Now, they said, they were simply looking forward to spending the rest of their days here, close to their family. There are other activities in the forest that have proved more rewarding than farming. Some of the world's richest deposits of minerals have been discovered in the Amazon. This is a new mine that has opened up a deposit of high-quality bauxite, the raw material for making aluminium. It was discovered near the Trombetas River, well into the heart of the Amazon, over 1,000 kilometers from the coast. Every piece of equipment, from the smallest screw to the heaviest machine, had to be shipped in by river. The people who work here, as on any new project in the Amazon, come from all over Brazil. The high cost of setting up the mine and building homes for 3,000 people was paid for by one Brazilian company and 5 foreign firms. The great attraction to invest in the project was the money to be made. The mine will soon be producing 8 million tons of bauxite a year and could go on for at least 65 years. To get the bauxite from the mine to the nearest river, a 30-kilometer stretch of railway line had to be built through the rainforest. At present, the trains bring down 9,000 tons of bauxite a day from the mine to the unloading point near the river. The bauxite is taken to the river, where it's picked up and exported once a week by ship. About half the profits from this valuable discovery are taken by the foreign companies who put money into the project. The rest, a question of several million pounds a year, is taken by Brazil. The rainforest, once it's been cut down, never entirely goes back into its original state. But in the case of mining, a relatively small area of destruction brings in large amounts of money from minerals. The value of other developments we've seen is much more questionable. For long periods of time, the Trans-Amazon roads are empty of traffic. They were never properly finished anyway. It proved too expensive to surface them. And there are many weak links that will now never be made good. To maintain the roads costs a fortune. Imagine the fuel bill alone for this repair work on the damage done by the heavy tropical rains. The biggest mistake, however, was to think that the forest could be turned into productive farmland. The thick vegetation suggests that the soil is very fertile. But in fact, the rainforest vegetation is extremely fragile. Every plant, every raindrop, has a part to play in keeping the earth below fertile. Clearing the forest to make way for farmland destroys the vegetation that supplies the soil with the nutrients it needs. Once the trees have gone, the soil turns poor and crops grow badly. Huge areas of the forest have already been destroyed for agricultural schemes which have never paid off. So much forest has been cut down for little or no reward that there is now great pressure on the Brazilian government to slow down its schemes for opening up the Amazon. If they don't, some people say that the forest will have all gone in 50 years from now. In the northeastern corner of Brazil, 500 kilometers inland from the sea, the sun rises over a landscape that is totally different from any other in the country. This is the heart of Brazil's dry zone, a vast area of territory where the rainfall is low and unreliable. Only a semi-desert kind of natural vegetation survives. This landscape is called Caatinga. Crops can grow here, but every 10 years or so, the rainfall drops way below average and the harvest fails. The dry zone, Brazil's poorest region, becomes a drought zone, and poorer still. Pau-Ferru is a small village in the Caatinga, 100 kilometers from the nearest town. After 2 years of poor rainfall, the village wells have run dry, and many people have given up and moved away. Now the village's only source of water is a stagnant pond that built up against the road embankment during the last downpour 6 months ago in February. Carminha da Silva is the eldest daughter of one of the families still pressing on through the drought in Pau Ferro. Carminha's family use this water for washing, cooking and drinking. Carminha's brothers are bringing in firewood, the one and only item Pau Ferro will get from the land this year. During the 40 years or so that Carminha's mother has lived in the dry zone, she's been through 4 big droughts. She is used to long periods of time when there's not enough to eat. This year, she said, the family will make do with beans and rice once a day, goat meat once a fortnight, green vegetables never. The water from the roadside pond has to make do for every domestic purpose. Boiled and mixed with flour, it's all Mrs. Da Silva has to give her younger children. The Da Silvas have grown accustomed to the harsh place they live in. Illness and death are almost part of everyday life. Mrs. Da Silva is especially tough. We asked her how many children she's had.
I had 15. 10 are still alive.
How did the children die?
The first one died of dysentery and vomiting. She was ill for 3 days. There's no doctor here, and I couldn't afford to take her to a doctor. Another girl died too for the same reason. And then a boy. All I could give him was medicine I had left over, but he died too.
When was the worst time Mrs. Da Silva can remember?
I think it's now. There was a bad time too when I was a child, but now is even worse because I've got a lot of children and can't afford enough things for them. Food, clothes, medicine for them when they're ill. Wages around here are not enough. We plant the crops every year, but we hardly get anything from the land.
Did Mr. Da Silva plant crops last year?
Plantei
I did.
feijão, milho,
Beans, corn
mandioca.
and cassava. Did it work?
Deu não. Faltou inverno.
No, it didn't. The rains didn't come. The area affected by the drought is a little larger than Britain. In all this, there is really only one important river, the São Francisco. It rises some distance to the south, where the climate is much wetter, and flows northwards right through the middle of the drought zone. In an area where the vegetation is a dull, monotonous brown, it's hardly surprising that the blue course of a major river should play a special part in the life of the region. The people who live on the banks of the São Francisco consider the river as belonging to them. They call it Old Frank. It's a term of affection for a river that is their means of transport and their source of water for washing, drinking, cooking, and irrigating their crops. In short, Old Frank is life itself. But in recent years, this special relationship between the riverside people and their Old Frank has in several places been totally destroyed. plan is underway to build 9 dams across the river, most of them in the drought zone. This one is the latest to be finished. It was built at a place called Sobradinho. It is in many ways the most stunning sight ever to appear in the Caatinga, a perfect symbol of the large, expensive development schemes Brazil is so fond of. It cost £366 million. It will eventually supply water for irrigation and is already generating hydroelectricity for the big cities of northeast Brazil. But £366 million wasn't the only price paid for Sobradinho. What was once a section of the São Francisco River is now the largest man-made lake in South America. 75,000 people who used to live by the river have had to abandon their homes. Some of the most thriving riverside communities and some of the richest farmland in the dry zone are now beneath the waters of Lake Sobradinho. As the lake filled up to its final size, the electricity company built 3 new towns at the lake shore to rehouse some of the people who lived by the river. One of them is Nova Casanova. The town is bright, breezy, and pleasant to look at. A tidier place than any of the old riverside settlements it replaces. Mrs. Braga is one of the 5,000 people who were obliged to move from their old home by the river to a new house in Nova Casanova. She lives here now with her husband João, a farmer. João and his wife are more than happy with their new home, rented from the electricity company. But the rest of the story of their move from the river to Nova Casanova is a disaster. First, what about the compensation João got for his land? The land that was flooded by the electricity company. João explains.
Bom, a indenização da gente foi muito curta, pelo menos a minha.
The compensation they paid to people was very little.
Muito baixa.
Mine was extremely low. I had a small piece of land with 23 fruit trees, coconuts, orange trees, guavas, mangoes and cashews. I had all that on my piece of land.
Tudo tinha dentro dessa rocinha.
And it was all flooded for next to nothing, for £58.
João now has a new piece of land rented to him by the electricity company. It's 10 kilometers outside Nova Casanova, a long way from his home. And there was a problem with the land too.
Bom, eles falavam que davam.
They said that they would offer a piece of land already cleared and fenced, but nothing like that happened.
Deu 700 cruzeiros e...
All they gave was £5 and 400 meters of wire, and that's not good for anything.
Essa minha, aquela partezinha que nós vinha ali...
The piece of land I have managed to get into shape was cleared and fenced with the help of friends.
The rest of João's new land is on a slope leading down to the lake. It's still in thick bush and covered in stones. And here is the biggest frustration of all. João's land reaches to the lakeside, but the water is virtually useless for irrigation. It's 5 meters below the level of the land it is supposed to irrigate, and cut off from it by the thick bush. Is there anything João can do to lift the water that far?
A não ser com motor, né?
Uma máquina. Only with a pump. A pump is the only way to get anything out of this land. And then I can make a little plantation and grow bananas, sugarcane, pawpaws, or whatever. But I can't afford to buy a pump.
Eu pelo menos não posso comprar motor, né?
You see, the banks lend you money to buy that kind of thing, but I'm terrified of that sort of business. Terrified.
muito medo desses negócios, né? Estou assombrado. O que eu tenho medo é que
The reason I'm afraid is that I might not be able to pay back the loan, go broke and end up with no land at all.
E aí a gente fica com a cara pra cima, a gente fica sem a roça, né?
See what I mean?
Não é isso?
Perhaps someone should have bought him a pump. But in a way, João was lucky. At least he and his fellow citizens in Nova Casanova got a new home and new land from the electricity company.
Não vai arrancar nada. Vai dar volta. Volta. É? De novo, né? Vai logo, ó. Zé. Vai logo, vou alguém para acidente.
But 40% of the people who lived by the river got scarcely any compensation at all, and they have been left virtually to fend for themselves, like the people now living in the small village of São Gonçalo, 10 kilometers from the lakeshore. São Gonçalo houses 30 families who used to live by the São Francisco River. 8 years ago, they were forcibly removed from their riverside land by the electricity company and left here to put up new homes for themselves deep inside the Caatinga. Six kilometers outside the village, the electricity company built a concrete water tank fed by water pumped up from underground. But the pump only works part of the time because the company doesn't deliver enough fuel to run it properly. In São Gonçalo, practically all they talk about still is the move from the riverbank and the predicament they have been in for the past 8 years.
Tudo é determinado por Deus. Mas o senhor que chamando por Deus... Não, tudo é determinado por Deus. Claro, eu sei que vamos chamar por Deus agora.
God and their own strength will see them through, they say. There are people in São Gonçalo who are almost obsessed about this disruption to their lives and will never forget it.
Eu morava na margem do rio de São Francisco. Plantava na terra firme.
I used to live on the banks of the São Francisco River. I used to farm land at the riverside and land on small islands in the river.
Eu tinha água para beber à vontade.
I had plenty of water for drinking, for washing and for cleaning clothes.
Eu plantava na margem do rio a cana.
I grew sugar cane by the river, cassava, sweet potatoes, corn, beans, bananas, onions, garlic, vegetables.
Tinha água à vontade para molhar.
There was plenty of water for the land.
Eu vim para aqui, para São Gonçalo.
Then I came here to São Gonçalo. We were moved here by the electricity company. We don't have water here. There is a little that we have to bring from almost 1 league away.
Aqui, o que aconteceu é que nós plantamos, mas Deus...
When we planted crops, God gave us a lot of rain in February. But in March, April and May, there was no rain at all. We are in God's hands. We lost everything in the end. Nobody got anything from the land. We might go 3 or 4 days without any real food, only scraps. It's a miserable situation we're in. We're suffering here in São Gonçalo, in the middle of the Caatinga.
Aqui em São Gonçalo, centro da Caatinga.
The village of Pau Ferro, untouched by dams and electricity schemes, sweats its way through the 40-degree heat of late afternoon. Of all the De Silva family's children, It is Carmenia who is being groomed for a different kind of life in the future. She goes to school regularly and is pampered with the best set of clothes the family has, and the only luxury in their house, makeup. What does Carmenia eventually intend to do?
I want to go far away, to Sao Paulo. I've heard about it on the radio. I think it must be good there. It's a big city, better than here.
She wants to go there because her uncle lives there. She wants to go there because she thinks it's better than here. All she thinks about is going there. The uncle lives better than us. He works as a driver. He earns real wages. You can't do that here. She thinks life here is bad. We can't give her what she needs here in the countryside. She never stops talking about it.
Morar nos matos, que é o que ela precisava, já não pode dar. Fica falando.
In the last week of August, 6.5 months into the drought, Mrs. De Silva lost another child, her youngest, a baby girl. Malnutrition, contaminated water.
My daughter fell ill, and in 5 days she had a temperature and a cold. She was ill for 5 days and then she died. She had a very high temperature and a terrible fever, and she died that day. If I had been able to take her to the doctor, I think she would have been saved. I couldn't give her enough vitamins. I didn't expect her to die.
It's only 40 years ago that over 2/3 of the people in Brazil lived in the countryside. For every one Brazilian who grew up in a town, there were 2 who spent their lives on the land. Now, all that has changed. The cities have grown at an alarming rate. This one's called Belo Horizonte. Like many others in Brazil, it's a city of newcomers. Belo Horizonte means beautiful horizon. A fair enough description of the areas where the well-off people live. But beautiful horizon hardly fits the big factory district where most of the city's industries are to be found. A factory job is what people who've moved in from the countryside are ideally looking for. But but the wages are rarely enough to pay the rent on a proper home. To find a place to live, the new arrivals move into a district like this. The Brazilians call it a favela. A favela is an area of homemade dwellings. The favelas in Belo Horizonte are growing all the time as new arrivals move in and put up their own homes. The building materials depend on what people can afford. The best favelas are made of bricks and concrete. The worst are nothing more than wooden shacks. This favela is 25 years old. 10 years ago, Mr. and Mrs. Da Silva moved in here from the countryside. Mr. Da Silva is a factory worker. His wife stays home to look after the family. Inside, their home is spotless. The Da Silvas are very house proud. They have 7 children, by no means unusual in Brazil. Their eldest child, Vera, is 16. She's been at work for a year. She and her father often talk about money. Between them, they only make just enough to get by. Like most people in the favela, the Da Silvas are a light-hearted family. But Mr. and Mrs. Da Silva themselves are much more solemn when they talk about their move to the city and the country area they came from.
Our life there was very humble.